Hello, and welcome to On Consciousness with Bernard Bars. I'm David Edelman. I'll be hosting today. My special guest is Jeffrey Krichmar from UC Irvine. Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're up to?
Sure. Thank you, David. Yeah, my name's Jeff Krichmar. I'm a professor at UC Irvine in the Department of Cognitive Science and Computer Science. And we study how the brain works by making computational models of the brain and putting them on robots. We call the whole idea neurorobotics. And we have a strong feeling that the brain needs a body. The catchphrase is the brain is embodied, the body is embedded in the environment. So over the years, going on 2 decades now, we've been studying different parts of the brain and different behaviors that animals have, and having these artificial brains on robots doing things like memory tasks, learning and memory, learning and conditioning, all sorts of interesting reflexes, and a lot of interesting navigation experiments over the years. So I want to tell you more about our work and where it began. And it began after I got my PhD and looking for something interesting to do, and I ran across the work by Gerald Edelman in the Neurosciences Institute. He was looking at Neural Darwinism and testing it on the Darwin series of brain-based devices. And at the time, there was no one doing this, where they were putting detailed brain models on robots, which we called brain-based devices. So when I saw this work and read this paper here from 1992, I said, I really want to join this group. This is just what I always wanted to do. So I got to the Neurosciences Institute in the late 90s. And what you're looking at here is Darwin 7. That was the first project I worked at when I got to the Neurosciences Institute. And we started this in the late 90s. And Darwin 7 was a brain-based device that was able to do conditioning, just like Pavlov's dog. And before I run this video, I want you to look at the robot or the brain-based device and what it's doing. So it picks up blocks, and the blocks are made of metal. And if the metal is conductive, it's good tasting. And the metal is non-conductive, it's bad tasting. That's his value. And in the upper right corner, you'll see his artificial brain in action. So of the upper right corner, the upper left panel has its early visual system, and every pixel there is an artificial neuron in its artificial brain. And the brighter the pixel, the more active that neuron. The upper right is a higher order brain area, like inferotemporal temporal cortex in the primate brain. The lower right is its value system. So when you see activity there, something of value or salient happened to the robot. So let's run the video. This is early in its lifetime. First time it's seen a stripe block. Picks it up. Its value system says, hey, that's good tasting. And it's starting to build up memory of what objects are good tasting. And it backs away, and now it's exploring again, and it picks up this spotted block. And this spotted block is bad tasting, but it doesn't know it until it picks it up. So now it has to remember that this shape is something that's predictive of bad value or negative value, and not to pick it up again. Just like Pavlov's dog or another experimental psychology experiment, after about 10 pairings, it's figured this out. So before I run the Darwin 7 after learning on the right side of this video, look at its brain area. So that object is oriented about 45 degrees off, and it still has enough brain activity to know that this is going to be good tasting. So it's predicting the value before it actually happens, which is pretty impressive for a machine to actually have that in its head, in its artificial head. Another important part of this is that object is oriented 45 degrees off, so it's different orientation. It's not exactly in its hand or gripper, so it's a different scale, and it's in a different position. So it's doing invariant object recognition. Let's run the video, and you see that as it gets closer, it gets more predictive of its value, and now it's picking it up, getting that yummy taste from the block. And then after this, it explores and looks for another block. It might see the spotted block, and it'll move right up to the spotted block, but it remembers that this is bad tasting. So then you get very strong activity from its higher order visual system, which is causing it to predict that this is bad value, and it backs away without tasting it. So later on, we actually said, well, let's see if we could do a more complicated visual system and test another idea of the theory of neural Darwinism, which is reentering connections between brain areas. So what you're looking at now is one of our next projects, which was Darwin 8. And we wanted to test an idea of neural Darwinism, that reentry or reentering connections between different brain areas can bind things together. And before I run this video, let me explain what you're looking at. So we're looking at V2, V4, IT. Those are different brain areas in the primate visual system. And each pixel, again, like before, is an artificial neuron in its brain, but we've colored the pixels of when they fire. So if you see two pixels or two artificial neurons the same color, that means they're firing synchronously together. And as I run this video, it's, again, looking at this object, which the size of it and the position of it is changing, but it's able to bind together the things that go with this object, like the color and shape. This actually was an important idea in neuroscience at the time, is how does the brain bind these things together? How do we see objects as a permanent thing so easily? And it made the prediction that we do this through reentering connections between different brain areas in our brain. And again, just like Darwin 7, I hit out a value system. So it learned that one of these objects out of the set was of positive value, and it would approach that. Sometime after Darwin 8, we were interested in another very important concept from neuroscience and cognitive science, which is episodic memory. How do we put together the what, when, and where of events in our life? And one of the important areas for doing this is the hippocampus. It seems to be very important for putting together what we call episodic or declarative memory. So this was one of the most complex projects I ever worked on. I worked with, again, Gerald Edelman and Joe Galley, and then we brought in Douglas Nitz. And Doug Nitz is an expert on rodent neurophysiology and had studied this area of the brain, the hippocampus, and the surrounding areas. So with their help, we were able to make, I think, one of the most detailed artificial neural networks at the time. If you look on the panels A and B towards the right, and I won't go into all the detail, but this had the hippocampus, details within the hippocampus, everything we knew about at that time about how this thing was wired up and what made it fire, plus all the different information that feeds into the hippocampus. So then the question became, how do you test this? So if you were a rat, you put a rat in a tank of water called the Morris water maze, and the rat would be swimming around the Morris water maze and find some position somewhere in that tank of water, and that would give it good value because then it could stop swimming. So we wanted to do this on a brain-based device, Darwin 10. So we made a dry variant of this experiment. So Darwin 10 is now exploring its environment like the rat would in the Morris water maze. And somewhere in the room, you'll see it in the upper right corner of the video, is a place that it can't see, but it can feel because it has a different reflectivity and it has a sensor to actually sense that. As it's moving around early on, it's building up information about place. And after some learning, it's put together the different places that can lead it on a route towards this object that allows it to get good value and not have to be in this tank anymore. And so after it bounces off this blue wall, it spins, and now it's found that spot right there. And it's able to go on to the next trial. So the next trial, it remembers that route and is able to go back to that spot. And we did this a number of times with a number of different Darwins, and no two Darwins actually solved it the same way, but they all solved it, which was also very interesting. It showed degenerate behavior. Degenerate as in no two individuals solve the same thing the same way. And the last video I want to show you is some recent work from my lab. So I'm in, as we said before, I'm at the University of California in Irvine. Our mascot is the anteater. And so the name of our lab is the Cognitive Anteater Robotics Lab, or CARL. And we wanted to build on this idea of episodic memory and understand how we build up schemas or contextual awareness as we build up memories. And this is work by myself and my graduate students just very recently. And we made a detailed model again of both the hippocampus and this time the prefrontal cortex. We decided that there were streams of information. One was the representation stream, which puts together objects and places. And another was an indexing stream, which indexes that information and consolidates it into long-term memory. And then to figure out what's new and what is familiar, we had some neuromodulation. So brain areas that modulate this activity and drive the learning of this information. And so this time the task we had was for the robot to find objects. So we cued it to say, find a teddy bear, and put it in a classroom. And it's looking around just as before, like Darwin 10, it's building up places and information. And it's looking for that teddy bear, but it's also learning a lot about its environment. And so it takes a while to find it, but it finds a teddy bear, picks it up, drops it off. So about 4 trials later, put it back in the same room, knows exactly where that teddy bear should be, remembers that, picks it up, puts it away. So then we put it into another room we call a break room that has different like food items that you find in a break room. We told it retrieve a cup. So it's looking around again as before, building up information about what's in this room, finds the cup, and brings it back and drops it off. And now, after a few trials, it knows exactly where that cup is, and picks it up and puts it back. So then one big question was, what if we put it back in the classroom? Will it remember the classroom after learning this new break room? Will it have obliterated what it had learned before? But because the system, like the brain, builds up context and what we like to call schemas, it has a schema for the break room and a schema for the classroom. So we put it back in the classroom, tell it to pick up a bottle of water, and it knows exactly where to pick that up. Then the last thing we did was cue it with something that it's never seen before, a banana. And it has to remember or think about, where would I find a banana? And it says, well, the banana should be in the break room on the table. And so that's its likelihood of where the banana would be. And lo and behold, it goes right to that table, finds its banana. I hope you've enjoyed this short video and my little story. You know, this began decades ago when really at the Neurosciences Institute, we were the only group that was doing this kind of work. And we started with looking at Pavlovian conditioning and seeing if a machine could actually have learning and memory, working up to more interesting behavioral work on memory, such as episodic memory. Then, though I didn't have time to go into it, a lot of visual perception, a lot of motor control. And over the years, the complexity kept growing and growing. And to my present day, where I'm running a lab, still following the same theme and following some of the same goals, and still looking at some of the interesting problems in neuroscience. But also there's a community now of people who are actually building smarter robots based on biology and how the brain works. And so it's really an exciting time to be in this field. And also with the advent of artificial neural networks getting very exciting, they're starting to turn to us and like-minded people to see how the brain works and if we can make even more intelligent artificial systems.